Hi everyone, welcome to lesson 3.3, Eukaryotes. So we're going to have a couple review slides. So remember, cells come in all shapes and sizes. All cells contain DNA, which is the molecule that carries biological information. All cells are surrounded by a cell membrane, sometimes also called the plasma membrane. And remember, cells fall into two broad categories. So we have our prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Last lesson, we talked about prokaryotic cells, and today we're going to talk about eukaryotic cells. So we're going to look at these two. So we have animal and plant cells, and we're also going to go through the organelles. So some of this may be review, but some of this may also be some new information. So prokaryotes, okay, they had no nucleus, DNA was free-floating. They are unicellular, and bacteria are prokaryotes, and that's kind of what we went over last class, over the structure as well. And today we have eukaryotes. And remember, eukaryotes are generally larger and more complex than prokaryotic cells. They contain dozens of internal structures known as organelles. DNA is found in the nucleus. Some are unicellular and some are multicellular. So again, right now you don't have to memorize this table. You're going to see this when we go into our evolution unit. But this is how we categorize things, and there were the three domains of life: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. Last time we talked about these two, bacteria and archaea, which were prokaryotic, and today we have eukarya, which is eukaryotic. You can see within the eukarya domain that we have the kingdoms protist, fungi, plants, and animals. Remember, eukaryotes can be unicellular or multicellular, but all multicellular organisms are eukaryotes. So first we're going to talk about the origin of eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotes are more complex than prokaryotes, and the oldest fossils of eukaryotic cells have been found in rocks of about 2.1 billion years old. A great deal of evidence has accumulated to support this theory that the evolution of important complex features of eukaryotic cells occurred through what we call endosymbiosis, which literally means living together within. So here's kind of a nice diagram showing that living together within endosymbiotic theory. So the endosymbiotic theory proposes that eukaryotic cells formed a symbiotic relationship among several different prokaryotic cells. And there's quite a bit of support for this theory. So first thing is mitochondria are similar to bacteria and have their own DNA genomes. Chloroplasts also have membrane systems that closely resemble those of photosynthetic prokaryotes. And the fact that some cells today contain bacteria and algae living in an endosymbiotic relationship also supports this theory. So this is something that we can still see today. So now we're going to talk about cell organization. Again, some of this may be a review. You've probably heard of organelles before, but some of it may also be new information. So we're not going to divide this into categories. So we're going to talk about the cytoplasm, then the organelles. We have the nucleus, our group of organelles that store, clean up, and support the cell here. Okay, we have our organelles that build proteins here. We have organelles that capture and release energy. And then last, we're going to talk about cellular boundaries. Okay, so first up, the cytoplasm and the nucleus. Because many of the structures within the cell act like specialized organs, they are known as organelles, which literally just means little organs. The eukaryotic cell is a complex and busy place, but it's relatively easy to distinguish between two areas, the nucleus and the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm in eukaryotic cells is all of the cellular contents outside of the nucleus, and in prokaryotic cells it was just all of the cell's contents, again because prokaryotic cells did not have a nucleus. The nucleus here is this purple structure in the animal and plant cell. It is a membrane-bound and closed structure that contains the cell's genetic material in the form of DNA. The nucleus is known as the control center of the cell, and it contains nearly all of the cell's DNA, and with that DNA comes the coded instructions for making proteins and other important molecules. So here's some additional information on the nucleus. The nucleus is surrounded by a nuclear envelope. So we can see that here in the structure, which is dotted with thousands of nuclear pores, so these things. Pores allow materials such as proteins, RNA, and other molecules to move into and out of the nucleus. Chromosomes, which carry the cell's genetic information, are also found in the nucleus. But most of the time, the chromosomes are spread throughout the nucleus in the form of chromatin, which we can see here. And as you're looking at it, you're probably like, oh, I don't really see anything. That's because chromatin's also often kind of compared to like spaghetti. Okay, So most of the time, chromosomes are spread throughout the nucleus in the form of chromatin, which is a substance that consists of DNA and protein. So it isn't that nice, like X-shaped chromosome that we're kind of used to seeing. When a cell divides, its chromosomes condense into those nice kind of X-shaped things that we are so familiar with, and then they can be seen under a microscope. But most of the time, it's in this form of chromatin. Most nuclei also contain a small, dense region known as the nucleolus, which is where the assembly of ribosomes begin. So now we're going to talk about the organelles that store, clean up, and support the cell. So first we have the vacuole, and that's the organelle that stores materials such as water, salts, proteins, and carbohydrates. In plant cells, there's a single, large, central vacuole here, filled with liquid. Vacuoles are also found in some unicellular organisms and in some animals. Next, we have what we call vesicles, and almost all eukaryotic cells contain vesicles which store and move materials between cell organelles, as well as to and from the cell surface. And then last, we have the lysosome, and that's a small organelle filled with enzymes that can break down lipids, carbohydrates, proteins into small molecules that can be used by the rest of the cell. They also break down organelles that have outlived their usefulness. So the lysosome is often called like the cleanup crew of the cell. So then we have our cytoskeleton, okay, and again, this is our organelles that store, clean up, and support. So the cytoskeleton is a network of protein filaments in a eukaryotic cell that gives the cell its shape and internal organization, and it can also be involved in movement. Certain parts of the cytoskeleton can help transport materials between different parts of the cell. And then here we have a fluorescence imaging of the cytoskeleton. So the microfilaments, kind of all this light purple area. And then we also have microtubules, which are these yellow area. And those are the main two protein filaments that make up the cytoskeleton. These green portions are the nuclei. So microfilaments are thread-like structures that are made up of proteins called actin. Microtubules are hollow structures made up of proteins called tubulins, and they are important in cell division. So we often get confused with the terms cytoskeleton, cytoplasm, cell membrane, cell wall. There's lots of C's. So the cytoplasm is the jelly-like fluid within the cell. Basically, everything was suspended in the cytoplasm, which was that area outside the nucleus. The cell membrane and the cell wall are the cell boundaries that we will talk about in a minute. The cytoskeleton is the internal organization component, so it's located within the cytoplasm. If you want an analogy, think of the human body. Our skin would kind of be like the cell barriers. You can think of your blood and all of your bodily fluids like the cytoplasm, and then the cytoskeleton would be similar to our skeleton because it provides that internal structure, and it's maybe also a little bit like our nervous system because all the filaments and proteins that aid in movement as well. So now we're going to talk about organelles that build proteins. So first we have the ribosome, which is an organelle consisting of RNA and proteins found throughout the cytoplasm in a cell, and it is also known as the site of protein synthesis. Ribosomes produce proteins by following the encoded instructions that come from DNA. Then we have our endoplasmic reticulum, or ER, where lipids, including those needed for cell membranes, are synthesized, along with proteins and other materials that are exported from the cell. So we have the rough endoplasmic reticulum and the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The rough endoplasmic reticulum has ribosomes on its surface. That's why it's called rough, because those ribosomes, and it's involved in the synthesis of proteins. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum does not have ribosomes on its surface. It contains enzymes that perform specialized tasks such as the synthesis of lipids and carbohydrates. So here are these steps for our organelles that build proteins. So first, proteins are assembled on ribosomes. Second, proteins complete their assembly on the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And then third, proteins are carried into the Golgi apparatus and vesicles. So here we have our Golgi apparatus, and that's the organelle that modifies, sorts, and packages proteins and other materials from the endoplasmic reticulum for storage in the cell or release outside of the cell. From the Golgi, proteins are shipped to their final destination inside or out of the cell. So the Golgi is often called like the UPS of the cell, and then here we have steps 4 and 5 of protein building. So the Golgi apparatus sorts and packages proteins, and then vesicles are shipped to their final destination. So here again is kind of that overview for the organelles that build protein. Okay, we have your ribosomes, rough endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, smooth endoplasmic reticulum is here, but again, that's not really necessarily involved in the protein process. Those are packaged in vesicles, go through the Golgi apparatus once again, vesicles shipped, organized, and then the proteins are exported. So now we're on to our organelles that capture and release energy. So the chloroplast, we've seen this quite a few times, but it's that organelle found in plants and some other organisms that captures the energy of sunlight and converts it into chemical energy. So remember, the chloroplast contains chlorophyll, and think of them like the cell's solar power plant. Then we have the mitochondria, which is the organelle that converts the chemical energy stored in food into compounds that the cell can use. So think of them like the cell's power plant, or everyone's favorite phrase, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. In humans, all or nearly all of our mitochondria come from the cytoplasm of the ovum, or the egg cell. So essentially what that means is that you get your mitochondria from your mom. And when we talk about genetics in Unit 4, then we're going to come back to that idea. But again, chloroplast and mitochondria contain their own genetic information in the form of small DNA molecules. And that, again, is supporting that endosymbiotic theory. So last, we're going to talk about our cell boundaries. We have the cell wall, which is a strong supporting layer around the cell membrane in some cells. Most prokaryotes and many eukaryotes, including plants and fungi, have cell walls, although animal cells do not have cell walls. Most cell walls are porous enough to allow water, oxygen, and carbon dioxide and certain other substances to pass through that easily. The cell membrane is the thin, flexible barrier that surrounds all cells, and it regulates what enters and leaves the cell. All cells contain a cell membrane, and most biological membranes are what we call selectively permeable, meaning that some substances can pass through it, but others cannot. Remember, the cell membrane is also sometimes called the plasma membrane. And next lesson, we're going to look at cellular transport, so we'll talk about both of these in more detail then. So here's kind of a nice summary chart. I know it's pretty small, so you may not be able to see it, but you can always go back to the PowerPoint within the assignment if you need to. Okay, and then here's also an optional video. Again, the video isn't narrated, but it is meant to show you a visual of what cells look like, as opposed to kind of our oversimplified textbook versions. So, a couple last things. You're going to see this slide come up a few times as we go further and further into the course. So far, we've marked off a few on here, talked about a few of these ideas, but we basically have 8 characteristics of living things. The past few lessons, the main focus has been number 1, that all life is made up of units called cells. So far we've covered cell theory, prokaryotic cells, and eukaryotic cells. So we've reached our exit ticket. Go ahead and compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells given what you've learned so far in Unit 3. And for today, there is not going to be a check yourself portion in the notes. Instead, we're going to talk about that next class. Okay, but go ahead and write out a few things on prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells on your notes, and then next class we will check that. So that is the end of lesson 3.3. Check your notes and your vocabulary, and thank you for watching.